My name is Camila. I'm 36 years old, a mother of two, and until recently, I would have described myself as lucky. I live in a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon. I work part time as a design consultant from home, the kind of job people assume is flexible and light, the kind that must be nice. If you met me at a school pickup line or at a dinner party, you'd probably describe me as calm, organized, dependable. The woman who remembers birthdays, who brings the extra dish, who smiles softly and lets other people finish their stories. What most people wouldn't notice is how carefully I observe everything. I've always been underestimated. Not because I lack intelligence or ambition, but because I don't perform either loudly. I don't interrupt. I don't dominate conversations. I don't compete for attention. And over time, that quietness became something people misread as smallness. This story isn't about betrayal in the dramatic sense. There was no affair, no screaming matches, no shattered plates. It's about something far quieter. It's about what happens when you slowly disappear inside your own life. I consider divorce because I felt invisible in my own home, and that sentence still feels heavier than I want it to. Loneliness can exist even when you sleep next to someone every night. For years, I told myself I was being too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding. I had a good man, a stable home, healthy children, nothing that would make headlines, nothing anyone would point to and say, "There, that's the problem." But invisibility doesn't make noise. It accumulates. This story is about the subtle erosion of being unheard, the small dismissals that don't look like cruelty, the role I accepted without realizing I had been assigned one. It's about the moment I stopped arguing, not because I gave up, but because I began thinking. And most importantly, it's about the difference between revenge and clarity. I didn't explode. I didn't threaten. I didn't destroy anything. I changed quietly. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way movies like to portray transformation. It was strategic, deliberate, almost invisible, until it wasn't. I'm not telling this story to paint myself as a victim, and I'm certainly not telling it to paint anyone else as a villain. I'm telling it because sometimes the most dangerous shift in a relationship happens in silence. Have you ever felt alone in a room where you technically weren't alone at all? If you asked my husband to describe me 5 years ago, he would have smiled and said, "Camila, she holds everything together." And he would have meant it as praise. To our friends, I was the reliable one, the one who remembered everyone's dietary restrictions, the one who coordinated birthday dinners and made sure gifts were wrapped, labeled, and signed. At school, other parents would say, "I don't know how you do it all." What they meant was, "You make it look effortless." Effortless is a dangerous compliment. Inside my home, I was the emotional regulator. If the kids were upset, I softened the moment. If my husband had a long day, I adjusted the atmosphere. I learned the temperature of every room before I spoke. I knew when to keep things light and when to absorb tension so it wouldn't spread. Absorbing became my specialty. When decisions needed to be made, financial, social, even logistical, I often did the research. I compared options. I calculated outcomes. Then I presented everything neatly, like a briefing. And somehow, by the end of the conversation, it would feel like his decision. At first, I didn't mind. I told myself a partnership didn't require credit. I believed love was demonstrated through support, not spotlight. But something subtle began to form. When guests complimented our home, they would turn to him. "You've done well for yourself." He would smile. "Yeah, we've been lucky." Lucky! I chose the paint colors. I negotiated the mortgage rate. I redesigned the kitchen layout to increase the property value by nearly 15%. But because I did it quietly, because I didn't narrate my competence, it dissolved into the background. Like me, at family gatherings, if I expressed an opinion about investments or long-term planning, it was met with polite nods. Then someone would look to my husband. "What do you think?" As if my thoughts were drafts waiting for male approval. He never corrected them. Not maliciously, just casually. And casual disregard is harder to confront than intentional cruelty. The children absorbed it too, without meaning to. If they wanted permission for something, they'd ask me first. But if I said no, they'd say, "Let's check with Dad." He became the final word. I became the preliminary filter. I started noticing how often I was interrupted. Not aggressively, just gently overridden. "Babe, that's not exactly how it happened." "Camilla worries too much. She's just being cautious." That word can shrink a woman inch by inch. From the outside, we look stable, functional, even enviable. There were no public cracks, no dramatic tension. But invisibility doesn't require hostility. It only requires repetition. I wasn't mistreated. I wasn't neglected financially. I wasn't shouted at or controlled. I was simply backgrounded. And the most unsettling part, I participated in it. Every time I let a correction slide. Every time I minimized my own expertise. Every time I smiled instead of clarifying. I reinforced the role they had learned to expect. Reliable, useful, steady, interchangeable. It would take me years to understand that being appreciated for what you do is not the same as being valued for who you are. It wasn't a betrayal. That's what made it so easy to dismiss. The first small cut happened on a Tuesday night in early autumn. The air outside still carried warmth, but the evenings had started to cool. I remember because the kitchen windows were slightly open, and I could hear the faint sound of leaves moving against the pavement. We were hosting dinner for two of my husband's colleagues and their partners. Nothing elaborate, just grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of Pinot Noir I had researched and selected because it paired well with citrus glaze. I had spent the entire day preparing, not obsessively, just carefully. I like environments to feel intentional, music curated, lighting warm, candles placed where they soften, not overpower. When everyone arrived, the conversation flowed easily, work stories, travel plans, a recent promotion that someone was hoping for. At some point, one of the guests mentioned rising interest rates and how they might affect refinancing. That's my territory. I had been studying the market trends for months, quietly. I had spreadsheets in my leather planner tracking projections, contingency plans, and potential investment pivots. So I spoke calmly. I actually think we're going to see a plateau before another climb, I said. There's been overcorrection in the last 2 quarters. If you're considering refinancing, waiting 6 months might give you better leverage. The table paused for half a second. Then my husband chuckled softly. Camila reads a lot of articles, he said, smiling in a way that looked affectionate. She's our in-house analyst. The group laughed lightly, not mockingly, just politely. One of the men turned back to my husband. So, what are you thinking of doing? And that was it. No one asked me to elaborate. No one questioned my reasoning. My comment became a charming side note instead of a contribution. But the real cut came later. After everyone left, the dishes stacked in the sink, I mentioned it. Not accusatory, just observational. When you said I read a lot of articles, I began, drying a plate slowly, it felt a little dismissive. He looked genuinely confused. Dismissive? I was complimenting you. I know, I said carefully. It just sounded like I was guessing. I've actually done quite a bit of analysis on it. He shrugged, grabbing a towel. Babe, it was just dinner conversation. You're overthinking it. Overthinking. There it was. A small word, a small dismissal. And because it was small, I questioned myself. Was I overthinking? Was I being sensitive? Was I expecting too much recognition for something that didn't matter? I told myself yes. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling fan rotating in slow circles. He fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady, predictable. Loneliness can exist even when you sleep next to someone every night. I didn't feel unloved. I felt unseen. The difference is subtle but profound. That dinner conversation replayed in my mind. Not dramatically, but analytically. It wasn't what he said. It was the pattern underneath it. The way my competence was softened into a hobby. The way my insight became endearing rather than authoritative. It was the first time I consciously noticed the dynamic. Not loud enough to fight about. Not serious enough to demand change. But sharp enough to leave a mark. And small cuts, left unattended, have a way of teaching people how much you're willing to tolerate. I didn't confront him again. Instead, I made a quiet decision I didn't even realize I was making. Next time, I would speak less. After that dinner, nothing dramatic changed. That was the problem. There was no apology to accept, no conflict to resolve, just a subtle recalibration in me. I began editing myself more carefully, trimming explanations, offering shorter answers, sometimes choosing silence entirely. At first, it felt mature, controlled. If my input was going to be reframed as cute or cautious, then perhaps it was easier not to offer it unless absolutely necessary. I told myself I was conserving energy, but repetition has a way of revealing patterns you can't unsee. A few weeks later, we were discussing where to put our year-end bonus. I had already run projections comparing high-yield savings accounts versus short-term municipal bonds. I'd even drafted a simple breakdown showing potential gains under conservative estimates. When I presented it, my husband skimmed the page. He said, that's a lot of detail. He set it aside. Let me talk to Mark. He's been investing longer than we have. Mark, his college friend who once asked me what APR stood for. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not jealousy, just displacement. I've already analyzed the risk exposure, I replied gently. It's pretty straightforward. Yeah, I know, he said quickly. I just want another opinion. Another opinion. I was not the final authority in my own household. I was a draft version waiting for external validation. Again, I said nothing more. And so it continued. At school events, other parents would ask my husband about our renovation plans. He would answer broadly, sometimes inaccurately, while I stood beside him holding the blueprint folder. If I clarified a detail, it was framed as a helpful addition, never as the primary source. At family holidays, if I expressed discomfort about scheduling or logistics, it became, Camila likes everything structured. Structured, as if foresight were a personality quirk instead of a skill. The most telling shift happened internally. I started anticipating dismissal before it occurred. I would rehearse sentences in my head and then decide they weren't worth the effort. I began asking myself, is this worth being minimized over? More often than not, the answer was no. Silence felt safer. I rationalized it. He works hard. He's stressed. He doesn't mean it that way. Intent became my favorite excuse. But impact doesn't disappear just because intent is benign. The children continued their subtle hierarchy. If I gave guidance, it was negotiable. If he repeated it, it became law. One evening, our son rolled his eyes when I reminded him about homework. Dad said I could finish it later. I hadn't heard that conversation. When I asked my husband privately, he shrugged. It's fine, he'll get it done. I nodded. But what I heard was this: your authority is flexible. Mine is final. And because I didn't challenge it firmly, that hierarchy solidified. The normalization wasn't loud. It was gradual. Like lowering the volume on a speaker so slowly you don't notice until the music is barely audible. I began to wonder when my voice had shifted from equal partner to background consultant. But I still loved him. That complicated everything. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't dismissive in the caricatured sense. He kissed my forehead before leaving for work. He thanked me for dinner. He told friends I was the backbone of the family. Backbones are essential. They're also invisible. And somewhere in that invisibility, I started feeling a quiet ache I couldn't name yet. Not resentment, not hatred, just erosion. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that makes you question whether you're shrinking or simply being placed somewhere smaller. I didn't fight it. I adapted to it. An adaptation, I would later learn, can be the most dangerous form of self-abandonment. I don't remember the exact day I understood it. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't an argument. It was a pattern crystallizing into clarity. I had been assigned a role, not maliciously, not consciously, but undeniably. I was the stabilizer, the behind-the-scenes operator, the one who ensured everything functioned smoothly while someone else stood at the front of the stage. Reliable, supportive, low maintenance, invisible. The realization came during a neighborhood planning meeting. We were organizing a charity fundraiser, something modest but detailed: budgets, vendor coordination, permits, and scheduling. Naturally, I began mapping it out. I created a shared spreadsheet. I outlined cost projections, I identified risks and backup options. At the meeting, when discussions became scattered, I calmly redirected everyone back to the agenda. People nodded. They followed my structure. But when it came time to assign a spokesperson for the event, all eyes turned to my husband. "You're great with people," someone said. "You should represent us." He hesitated only briefly before agreeing. No one asked who had built the framework he would now present. And I smiled. Of course I did. On the drive home, he squeezed my hand. "We make a good team," he said. Team, that word lingered. Because teams share visibility. Teams rotate leadership. Teams acknowledge contributions openly. But this wasn't rotation. It was an expectation. Over time, I began to see how deeply the role had embedded itself into our marriage. When guests arrived, I prepared the environment. When decisions arose, I prepared the information. When conflicts surfaced, I softened the edges. And when recognition appeared, it drifted elsewhere. The role wasn't oppressive. It was comfortable. For everyone except me. I had become the infrastructure. And infrastructure is only noticed when it fails. The most unsettling part was how easily I fulfilled it. I was good at it. I anticipated needs before they were spoken. I calculated outcomes before risks emerged. I prevented problems quietly, which meant no one ever saw the crises that never happened because I had already handled them. There's no applause for disasters avoided. One evening, while organizing our monthly expenses, I realized something almost clinical. If I stopped doing half of what I did, things wouldn't collapse immediately. They would slowly unravel. Missed deadlines, overlooked payments, unplanned expenses, social obligations forgotten. Not catastrophic, just messy. And in that mess, I would finally become visible. That thought startled me, not because I wanted chaos, but because I understood my value had become conditional on constant output. I wasn't seen for my mind. I was appreciated for my maintenance. Even my emotional restraint had been absorbed into the role. If something bothered me, I processed it privately. I didn't create scenes. I didn't demand reassurance. I had trained everyone, including him, to expect resilience without reinforcement. And people adapt quickly to what feels effortless. One night, standing alone in the kitchen, after everyone had gone to bed, I looked around at the home I had helped build, the lighting I chose, the layout I redesigned, the financial buffers I had secured, everything stable, everything functioning. And yet, I felt like a guest in the narrative of my own life. I wasn't oppressed, I wasn't abused, I was assigned. Assigned to be indispensable but not centered. That was the role. And for the first time, instead of feeling hurt, I felt something colder. Clarity, because once you can name the role, you can decide whether to keep playing it. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon in complete silence. I was sitting at the kitchen island with my leather-bound planner open in front of me. Sunlight spilled across the marble countertop, catching the gold edges of the pages. The house was unusually still. The kids were at school, my husband was at work. Even the dishwasher had finished its cycle. There was nothing wrong, and that was the moment I realized something was. I had just finished reviewing our quarterly finances, investments stable. The emergency fund is strong, mortgage on track to be refinanced under better terms. Because I had waited, just like I'd predicted months earlier. I should have felt proud. Instead, I felt detached. I flipped back through previous pages in my planner. Budgets, renovation notes, school schedules, long-term projections, evidence of constant vigilance, constant contribution. I imagined what would happen if I stopped documenting, stopped planning, stopped anticipating. The house would still stand. Dinner would still be cooked. Eventually, bills would still get paid, late perhaps, but paid. Life would continue, just not optimally. And in that subtle decline, my absence would finally be measurable. That thought didn't bring satisfaction. It brought a quiet, unsettling understanding. I had built a life where my excellence was expected, not acknowledged. I wasn't angry at him in that moment. I wasn't even sad. I was awake. For years, I had equated love with endurance, with smoothing rough edges, with absorbing small dismissals because they weren't a big deal. But invisibility isn't a single event, it's cumulative. And suddenly I saw the pattern not as isolated moments, but as a system where I had made myself smaller to maintain harmony, a system where my silence was interpreted as agreement, a system where my stability allowed others to shine without ever needing to look back. I closed the planner gently, and instead of asking, "How do I fix this?" I asked a different question. What would happen if I stopped trying to be understood and started preparing to be independent? That was the shift. Not divorce papers, not threats, preparation. I didn't decide to leave that day, but I decided something far more significant. I would no longer rely on being valued. I would ensure I was secure. There's a difference. Valuation is external, security is internal. I realized that if I ever needed to walk away, I could. Financially, emotionally, logistically. The only thing tethering me was the hope that he would eventually see me clearly. Hope is fragile leverage. I didn't want to argue for visibility anymore. I wanted options. So, that afternoon, in the quietest way possible, I opened a separate tab on my laptop and began reviewing information I had never allowed myself to explore seriously before. Not out of vengeance, not out of panic, out of clarity. For the first time, my silence wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about gathering power. And power, I was beginning to understand, does not need to announce itself to be real. After that Wednesday, my silence changed. Before, it had been reflexive, protective, the kind of quiet that avoids friction. Now it was deliberate. There's a difference between silence born from fear of being dismissed and silence chosen because you no longer need validation. One feels small, the other feels controlled. I stopped volunteering corrections in social settings. If he misrepresented a detail about our renovation timeline or our financial strategy, I let it pass. Not because I agreed, but because I no longer needed the room to understand my role. Clarity had already happened privately. At home, I adjusted in subtle ways. I still handled the bills, but I stopped reminding him when they were due. I still organized school events, but I didn't fill his calendar automatically. If he forgot something minor, I let the consequence land softly instead of intercepting it midair. Nothing catastrophic, just natural outcomes. At first, he didn't notice. Why would he? The system I had built was resilient. It didn't collapse overnight. But I noticed something else. Without my constant anticipatory energy, small inefficiencies surfaced. A late RSVP, a duplicated payment, a forgotten parent-teacher email that required a last-minute adjustment. He began saying things like, "Oh, I thought you had that covered." And I would respond evenly, "I didn't realize it needed covering." No sarcasm, no edge, just facts. My calm unsettled him more than confrontation ever would have. One evening, he looked at me across the dinner table and asked, "Are you okay? You've been quieter." "I'm fine," I said honestly, "just thinking." That was true. I was thinking constantly, but not about how to fix him, not about how to argue better. I was thinking about sustainability. Could I remain in a marriage where my voice functioned as background input? Could I accept being essential but not central? Could I live another decade being appreciated for output rather than perspective? I wasn't emotional about these questions. I approached them like I approached investments, long-term viability analysis. The more composed I became, the more he misread it. He interpreted my quiet as contentment, stability, even maturity. "You've seemed less stressed lately," he said once, almost relieved. I smiled slightly. "Maybe I am." In a way, I was. When you stop fighting to be seen, you conserve enormous energy. But there's a danger in that too. Because when silence becomes strategic, it creates distance that's difficult to measure until it's vast. I began documenting more intentionally. Not arguments, but patterns. Not grievances, but data. Financial flows, asset allocations, ownership structures, insurance policies, retirement accounts. Not because I planned to use them, because I wanted to know that I could. And here's what shifted most profoundly. I stopped trying to prove my intelligence. In conversations, I listened more than I spoke. When someone underestimated me, I didn't correct them. I observed. I stored information. I noted who deferred to whom. Power reveals itself when you stop announcing yours. He mistook my restraint for softness, but softness can hold steel underneath. At night, lying beside him, I no longer felt the sharp loneliness from that autumn evening months ago. Instead, I felt something cooler. Autonomy forming. And autonomy is quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't plead. It prepares. I wasn't punishing him. I was detaching from dependency on being recognized. And once you detach from needing to be seen, you start asking a different question entirely. If I am capable of building this life quietly, what else am I capable of building alone? The interesting thing about preparation is that it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. From his perspective, I was simply calmer, more self-contained, less likely to debate minor details. From mine, I was building optionality. I began with information, not emotion. I scheduled a routine financial review with our advisor, something I had done before. But this time, I asked different questions: ownership structures, beneficiary designations, liquidity timelines, tax implications if assets were reallocated under various scenarios. I didn't mention divorce. I didn't imply dissatisfaction. I simply wanted clarity. Clarity is neutral. At home, I digitized years of paperwork, mortgage documents, insurance policies, property records, retirement accounts, business contracts from my consulting work. I organized them in encrypted folders, backed them up, labeled everything meticulously. No one noticed. Why would they? It looked like routine maintenance, the very role I had always played. But internally, something fundamental was changing. I reopened professional connections I had allowed to go dormant. Former clients, industry contacts. I updated my portfolio website quietly, refreshed testimonials, scheduled a few catch-up coffees that looked social but weren't entirely. I wasn't plotting an exit. I was ensuring competence beyond this household. There's a psychological shift that happens when you realize you are not trapped. You are simply choosing to stay. Choice is power. I also began observing dynamics more objectively. At dinners, I watched how often he interrupted me versus how often he interrupted others. In conversations with the children, I tracked when my authority was overridden and when it was supported. During decision-making, I noted whether my input was incorporated or reframed. Not to build a case. To measure reality, patterns became undeniable when documented. And here's what they never noticed. My emotional temperature stabilized completely. When you stop seeking validation, criticism loses its sting. When you stop arguing for space, dismissal becomes data instead of injury. One Saturday morning, he made a casual comment about a new investment opportunity a colleague had mentioned. "It sounds promising," he said. "Mark thinks it could double in 5 years." Old Camilla would have immediately researched it, analyzed risk exposure, and presented pros and cons. Instead, I looked at him steadily. "If you'd like, I can review the prospectus." He hesitated. "It's fine, that's fine, I'll handle it." I nodded once. "Okay." And I meant it. If he wanted final authority, he could carry final responsibility. Weeks later, when the investment underperformed projections, he seemed mildly frustrated. "I should have looked deeper into it," he admitted. I simply replied, It happens. No correction, no quiet triumph. Just neutrality. Neutrality unsettles people because it removes emotional leverage. The children began noticing small differences too. If they asked me for permission and then attempted to escalate to their father, I calmly said, "You already have my answer." And if he contradicted me, I didn't argue in front of them. I addressed it privately, briefly, and factually. "We need to align," I said once. "Consistency matters." He agreed, and for a while he improved. But alignment isn't sustainable when the underlying perception hasn't shifted. He still saw me as steady, capable, supportive. He did not yet see me as autonomous, and autonomy was growing quietly, like roots beneath concrete. The most profound preparation wasn't financial. It was emotional. I practiced imagining life in two versions, one where nothing changed and one where everything did. I evaluated both without panic, without fantasy. Could I rebuild? Yes. Would it be uncomfortable? Certainly. Would I survive? Absolutely. Once those answers felt solid, something irreversible settled inside me. I was no longer afraid of losing the marriage. I was only afraid of losing myself. And that fear had finally become stronger. They never noticed this shift because it didn't demand attention. Preparation rarely does. It moves quietly. It gathers evidence. It waits. And I was almost ready to see what all that quiet strength actually meant. The leverage didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It emerged slowly, through numbers. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at the dining table with my laptop open and my planner beside me. The house was dark except for the small lamp near the window. It cast a soft circle of light over spreadsheets that most people would have found painfully dull. I found them clarifying. Over the past months, I had separated our financial structure in my mind. Not physically yet, but conceptually. What was jointly owned? What was individually titled? What was earned by him? What was generated by me? What had grown because of the strategic timing I had implemented? When you look at your life through clean data, emotion loses its distortion. And that's when I saw it clearly. If I left, I would not be destabilized. In fact, in certain scenarios, if assets were liquidated at optimal times, if my consulting contracts expanded at the rate they were currently trending, I would be more than stable. I would be free, not surviving. Free. I sat back in the chair and let that settle. For years, the invisible thread that kept me compliant was the assumption that leaving would be chaotic, financially risky, disruptive to the children in ways I couldn't control. But I had already controlled so much. I knew the equity in our home. I knew the tax implications of restructuring assets. I knew the earning potential of my skill set if I transitioned from part-time to full-time. I knew the custody frameworks in our state, not in detail, but enough to understand that I would not be erased. There was no dramatic secret account, no hidden inheritance. The leverage was competence, and competence, compounded over time, becomes quiet power. I closed my laptop slowly, not with excitement, not with triumph. With calm. This was the private reveal. I was not staying because I had to. I was staying because I had been hoping. Hope is softer than fear, but it can tether you just as firmly. The next morning, nothing looked different. I made breakfast, packed lunches, kissed him goodbye. But inside, something had solidified. I stopped fantasizing about him finally seeing me. I stopped rehearsing conversations where I explained my hurt in perfect language. Because the power dynamic had already shifted internally, I no longer needed him to validate my value. I had quantified it. That realization did something unexpected. It made me kinder. When he spoke over me at a gathering the following weekend, I didn't feel the old sting. I simply noted it. When he described our finances in simplified terms that excluded my contributions, I let him finish, because I knew something he didn't. If the narrative ever needed correction, I had documentation. Leverage is not about threat. It's about certainty. Certainty that you can stand on your own infrastructure. Certainty that if the structure shifts, you won't collapse with it. And here's the part that surprised me most. I didn't feel eager to use it. I didn't want to punish him. I didn't want to win. I wanted alignment. But alignment requires mutual awareness. And I was beginning to suspect that if I ever revealed how prepared I was, it would not create closeness. It would create shock, because the quietest people are rarely expected to have contingency plans. That night, lying in bed, I listened to his breathing again. Steady, familiar. Loneliness can exist even when you sleep next to someone every night. But now the loneliness felt different. It was no longer the ache of being unseen. It was the distance of already knowing you could walk away. And once you know that, a decision begins forming, whether you intend for it to or not. The decision didn't arrive in anger. It arrived in contrast. About 3 weeks after my private reveal, we attended another dinner, this time at a friend's home. The conversation drifted toward career transitions and long-term goals. Someone asked me directly, "Camila, would you ever expand your consulting into a full firm?" Before I could answer, my husband smiled. "She likes keeping things manageable," he said. "Low stress. It works for us." It works for us. The words weren't cruel. They were confident, final, as if my ambition had already been mutually agreed upon and capped. I looked at him, not with irritation, not with embarrassment, with clarity, because I had never said I wanted to keep things small. I had adjusted my scale to accommodate the ecosystem of our marriage. I had reduced visibility to maintain balance. And in doing so, I had allowed my ceiling to be quietly installed by someone who didn't even realize he was lowering it. On the drive home, I didn't mention it. Instead, I asked him a simple question. "Do you think I limit myself?" He glanced over, surprised. "What do you mean?" "In general," I said calmly. "Professionally." He hesitated. "I think you've chosen what works for our family." Chosen. That word echoed. Had I chosen, or had I adapted? That night, after he fell asleep, I didn't open my spreadsheets. I didn't review documents. I didn't analyze projections. I sat in the dark and allowed myself to imagine two futures again. In one, I stayed. We continued as we were. I remained stable, respected in theory, backgrounded in practice. The children grew up absorbing subtle hierarchies. I expanded my work cautiously, careful not to disrupt the balance. In the other, I disrupted everything. Not loudly, not destructively, but definitely. I expanded fully. I claimed authority without pre-approval. I structured my life around mutual recognition, or solitude. Both futures were survivable, but only one felt honest. Here is what people misunderstand about decision points. They are rarely about the final straw. They are about accumulated truth. The truth was this: I no longer trusted that he saw me as an equal architect of our life. And without that equality, love begins to feel like a role instead of a partnership. I did not hate him. I did not want to punish him. I simply did not want to shrink anymore. The irreversible option wasn't divorce paperwork, not yet. It was an internal commitment. Commitment to expansion regardless of his comfort. Commitment to transparency about my capabilities. Commitment to no longer editing myself to preserve ease. Once you commit internally, the external steps follow naturally. And I knew something else with unsettling calm. If he resisted my expansion, the marriage would not survive it. If he supported it, the dynamic would have to rebalance dramatically. Either way, the version of us that existed would end. And strangely, that didn't terrify me. It clarified me. I turned toward him in the dark, studying the outline of his face softened by sleep. For years, I had waited for him to notice my depth. Now I was preparing to reveal it, not through argument, through action. And once actions begin moving in silence, outcomes follow. I had reached the point where staying small felt more dangerous than standing alone. That was the decision. Once the decision settled inside me, my movements became precise. Not rushed, not reactive. Precise. The first thing I did was expand my consulting availability, quietly. I informed 3 long-term clients that I would be opening additional capacity in the next quarter. I didn't frame it as a trial, I framed it as a shift. Their responses were immediate and telling. "We've been waiting for you to scale. I didn't think you wanted more. Let us know your new rates." New rates. I raised them by 20%. No apology, no over-explanation. Every client accepted. Revenue projections adjusted upward almost instantly. At home, I didn't announce this as a transformation. I mentioned it casually over dinner one evening. "I'm increasing my workload next quarter," I said, passing the salt. He looked mildly surprised. "Oh, that's a lot more hours." "It's manageable," I replied, "and financially it makes sense." He nodded slowly. "If that's what you want." If that's what I want. There was curiosity in his voice, but also distance, as if he were observing a new feature rather than recognizing a long suppressed trait. Simultaneously, I scheduled a consultation with an attorney, not to file, to understand. Information is not betrayal, it's preparation. The meeting was clinical. Asset division norms, custody frameworks, mediation timelines. I asked direct questions, took notes, clarified worst case and best case scenarios. When I walked out of that office, I didn't feel dramatic, I felt oriented. Back home, nothing outwardly changed. I still made breakfast, still attended school events, still sat beside him on the couch in the evenings. But I stopped cushioning his oversights. When he forgot to transfer funds before a billing cycle and incurred a small fee, I didn't intercept it. "Oh," he muttered, noticing the charge. I looked up from my laptop. "We can adjust the process if you'd like. No blame, just options." He began noticing friction where there had previously been smoothness. "Things feel busier lately," he said one night. "They are," I replied. "Not tense, just factual. My calendar is filled. My energy is redistributed." I was no longer allocating 90% of my strategic thinking to the household. And here's what fascinated me most. The world responded differently when I occupied space without apology. Clients deferred to my authority. Vendors negotiated on my terms. Even acquaintances began asking for my professional opinion directly, rather than through him. At home, he seemed slightly unsettled, not threatened exactly, just off balance. "You've been very focused lately," he observed. "I have been," I said. He studied me for a moment longer than usual. Silence used to mean I was absorbing. Now it meant I was building. And he could feel the difference, even if he couldn't articulate it. I wasn't punishing him. I wasn't withdrawing affection. I wasn't creating scenes. I was shifting weight. And when weight shifts in a structure, stress redistributes. He began stepping into tasks he had long assumed were handled, not because I demanded it, but because they were no longer invisibly completed. The ecosystem was recalibrating. He just didn't yet understand that recalibration can lead to two outcomes: stronger equilibrium or a structural fracture. And the determining factor would not be my silence this time. It would be his awareness. I was no longer afraid of either result, because I had already proven to myself that I could stand independently. Now I was waiting to see if we could stand equally. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They accumulate in the atmosphere. At first, it was subtle. A shift in tone. A slight hesitation before he answered questions about plans he hadn't fully considered. The house still functioned, but differently. Because I was no longer pre-solving everything, small gaps appeared. School forms were submitted closer to deadlines. Travel bookings require double-checking. Budget conversations happened more frequently because my increased income had altered the dynamic. For years, my contributions had been integrated so seamlessly that they felt ambient. Now they were visible, and visibility changes perception. One evening, while reviewing our monthly overview, he frowned at the screen. "I didn't realize your consulting had grown this much," he said. "It has," I replied evenly. He leaned back in his chair. "That's significant." There was something in his voice I couldn't immediately label. Surprise, yes, but also recalculation. For the first time, the numbers didn't position me as supplemental. They positioned me as parallel. And that created tension. Not aggressive, not explosive, just unfamiliar. At dinner with friends, someone asked about my recent projects. Before he could answer on my behalf, I spoke first. "I've expanded into full-scale residential contracts," I said. "I'm restructuring my client intake model." The table turned toward me. Questions followed, detailed ones. He stayed quiet. I noticed it. He noticed it. Later that night in the car, he said lightly, "You've been making big moves." "I have," I said. There was a pause. "You didn't really talk to me about it." I kept my voice calm. "I mentioned it when I decided." "That's not the same as discussing it." Ah, there it was. For years, I had presented fully formed strategies and allowed him to reshape them. Now I was informing instead of seeking approval. It unsettled him, not because he opposed my growth, but because it disrupted the established hierarchy. "I'm not asking for permission," I said gently, "but I'm not hiding anything either." He nodded slowly, staring ahead at the road. The children began adjusting too. When our daughter asked for permission to attend a weekend event and I said yes, she didn't escalate to him. That small behavioral change carried weight. Authority was being redistributed. He began inserting himself more actively into household logistics, sometimes clumsily. There were moments of frustration when he realized how many micro-decisions had previously been invisible to him. "Why is this so complicated?" he muttered once while trying to coordinate a school pickup change. It always was, I replied. You just didn't have to manage it. I didn't say it to wound. I said it as information. And information, when delivered calmly, can be more confronting than an accusation. The emotional temperature between us shifted. Not colder, not warmer, just more aware. He began watching me more closely, like he was trying to understand a version of me he hadn't fully registered before. One night, he asked quietly, "Are you unhappy?" The question hung in the air. I considered lying for comfort. Instead, I chose precision. I was invisible for a long time, I said. I'm not willing to be that anymore. He didn't argue. He didn't dismiss it. He just looked at me differently. And for the first time, I saw something in his expression I hadn't seen before. Not defensiveness, concern, because the consequences were no longer logistical. They were relational. The ecosystem was shifting from convenience to consciousness. And once awareness enters a dynamic, you can't return to sleep. He was beginning to feel the loss, not of me physically, but of the version of me that required less adjustment. And I knew we were approaching the point where comfort would no longer be enough to hold us together. Awareness can arrive quietly, but once it settles, it changes the air. After that night, the night I said I had been invisible, something in him shifted from mild concern to urgency. Not dramatic urgency, not panic, but a tightening. He started asking more questions. Did I interrupt you at dinner? Do you feel like I don't support you? Why didn't you tell me sooner? The questions weren't defensive. They were searching, and months earlier I would have felt relieved. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? Recognition, curiosity, effort. But timing matters. When someone begins listening only after you've stopped needing them to, the impact lands differently. One evening, he suggested we revisit our long-term plans. Maybe we should realign, he said. Make sure we're on the same page. The phrase would have comforted me a year ago. Now, it felt like a strategy meeting called after the merger had already quietly dissolved. We sat at the kitchen table, same marble surface, same soft lighting, but the energy was unfamiliar. I didn't realize you felt sidelined, he admitted. I always thought we were a team. I know you did, I said gently. Then why does it feel like you've already moved somewhere else? Because I had, not physically, not legally, internally. There's a moment in any emotional shift when repair is technically possible, but the desire for repair has weakened. That's the part no one talks about. He began stepping forward more deliberately. He deferred to me in conversations, he asked for my opinion, and waited for it fully. He corrected someone once at a gathering. Actually, that was Camilla's strategy. I noticed, but I also noticed something else. His adjustments were reactive. They were responses to perceived loss. And I had already built a life where I no longer feared that loss. That changes the chemistry of reconciliation. One night, he reached for my hand in bed and said quietly, "I don't want to lose you." The words were sincere, and they hurt more than dismissal ever had, because I wasn't sure if what he feared losing was me or the stability I provided. "I'm still here," I said, but it wasn't the reassurance he hoped for. We tried to have deeper conversations about equity, about ambition, about shared authority. He listened more carefully now. He interrupted less. He even admitted, maybe I got comfortable. Maybe. Comfort can erode intimacy when it's built on unequal weight distribution. Here's the truth I couldn't say aloud yet. I no longer wanted to fight for space in a structure that required me to shrink first in order to expand. Even if he was willing to change, I wasn't sure I could unknow the years of invisibility. I wasn't sure I could unlearn the version of myself that had prepared to stand alone. Because preparation alters attachment. When you've already rehearsed independence, dependency feels optional. He was trying, I could see it. But something irreversible had happened inside me the day I stopped hoping and started planning. And once hope transforms into contingency, the emotional architecture shifts permanently. Repair requires vulnerability from both sides. I had already armored mine with competence, and I wasn't sure I knew how to set that armor down again. That was the quiet tragedy of it. No explosion, no betrayal, no dramatic collapse. Just a realization that sometimes growth, once it becomes self-sustaining, doesn't circle back. It continues forward. And forward doesn't always include the person who only began adjusting when they felt you slipping away. He was ready to fix it. I wasn't sure I still wanted it fixed. The final confrontation didn't feel like a battle. It felt like a boardroom meeting. We sat across from each other at the dining table on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The children were at a friend's house. The sky outside was pale, undecided between sun and rain. There was no raised voice, no trembling hands, just clarity. He spoke first. "I can feel you pulling away," he said, "and I don't know how to reach you." His tone wasn't angry, it was steady, measured. I'm not pulling away, I replied calmly. I stopped shrinking. The distinction hung between us. He looked down at his hands. I didn't know you felt small. I didn't either, I said. Not at first. Silence settled, but it wasn't hostile. It was reflective. I thought we were aligned, he continued. I thought we both liked the roles we had. That's the problem, I said gently. They became roles. Not partners, not equals. Roles. He absorbed that slowly. I've been trying to change, he said. I see that. And it doesn't matter? The question wasn't accusatory, it was vulnerable. It matters, I answered. But change that starts when someone feels you're leaving is different from change that happens when you truly see them. He exhaled quietly. I see you now. I believed that he thought he did. But being seen after you've already built independence feels different than being seen when you're still reaching. I don't want to compete for oxygen in my own marriage, I said. My voice remained even. And I don't want to resent you for something you didn't intentionally do. So what are you saying? There it was, the point of articulation. I'm saying I need a life where my presence isn't optional. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in comprehension. Are you asking for a separation? I'm considering it. The word landed softly but firmly. No threats, no ultimatums, just truth. He stood up and walked toward the window, staring out at the quiet street. I wish you had told me sooner. I did, I said, just not in ways that sounded urgent. He nodded slowly. That part, at least, he understood. For years, my discomfort had been framed as overthinking, sensitivity, caution. Now it was structural. Do you love me? He asked finally, still facing the window. Yes, I said. And it was true. Love wasn't the issue. Alignment was. He turned back towards me. Then why does this feel final? Because once you've proven to yourself that you can stand alone, staying requires a different kind of partnership. One rooted in equality, not comfort. I don't know if we know how to rebuild without the old imbalance, I said quietly. No one cried. No one shouted. No one stormed out. It was a confrontation stripped of drama. Just two adults realizing that good intentions don't erase long-standing dynamics. We agreed to take space, not impulsively, logistically, thoughtfully. And as we discussed, next steps, temporary separation, mediation options, timelines, the strangest thing happened. I didn't feel fear. I felt steady, not triumphant, not vindicated. Steady, because this wasn't about winning. It was no longer disappearing. And I had already reclaimed myself long before this conversation ever began. It has been 11 months since that Sunday. The house is quieter now, but not emptier. We chose a structured separation first. Mediation instead of litigation, conversations instead of accusations. It wasn't seamless, but it was respectful. In the end, respect was something we could salvage, even if the marriage wasn't. I moved into a townhouse 15 minutes away, close enough for the children to move between homes without disruption, far enough for me to feel the psychological shift of ownership. The first night alone was not dramatic. No tears on the kitchen floor, no symbolic unpacking scenes. I placed my leather-bound planner on the counter, looked around at the unfamiliar walls, and felt something settle. Not relief, alignment. For the first time in years, the environment reflected only my decisions. The furniture arrangement, the lighting, the pacing of the evening. Silence, when it came, belonged to me. Loneliness can exist even when you sleep next to someone every night. But solitude, chosen solitude, feels entirely different. My consulting business expanded fully within 6 months. I hired a junior designer, rebranded under my own name instead of operating quietly under shared networks. I speak in client meetings without deferring. I set terms without rehearsing them first in my head. There is no one to override me, and interestingly, there is no one to resent. He and I co-parent with intention. We communicate clearly. In some ways, we are more honest now than we were when we shared a bed. He once said to me during a custody schedule review, "I didn't realize how much you were carrying." I nodded. I didn't either. That's the truth. I wasn't a martyr. I was complicit in my own invisibility. I had mistaken silence for strength and accommodation for love. Strength, I've learned, is not how much you can endure quietly. It's how clearly you can define your boundaries without raising your voice. I'm not bitter. That surprises people. There is no villain in this story. Just two people who adapted to a dynamic until it no longer fit one of them. I do not hate him. I do not regret the years we built together. They shaped me. They refined me. They showed me what I am capable of constructing from nothing. But I am no longer interested in being the infrastructure for someone else's spotlight. I am the architect now, publicly, unapologetically. And here's what has changed most profoundly. I speak without pre-editing myself. If I disagree, I articulate it calmly. If I want more, I state it clearly. If something diminishes me, I address it once. Not repeatedly, not desperately. Once. Because I no longer need anyone to validate that my perspective holds weight. I've already measured it. The woman who once lay awake staring at the ceiling fan, wondering if she was overthinking, would not recognize this version of me immediately. But she would feel safe with her, and that, more than anything, tells me I made the right decision. I am not louder now. I am not harsher. I am not hardened. I am simply visible to myself first. And that visibility is no longer negotiable. If you've listened this far, you might be waiting for a villain. There isn't one. No affair, no betrayal, no dramatic courtroom scene. Just a slow realization that love without visibility becomes loneliness. I considered divorce because I felt invisible in my own home. And that sentence used to sound extreme, even to me. But invisibility is not measured by how loudly someone mistreats you. It's measured by how often you silence yourself to maintain peace. Loneliness can exist even when you sleep next to someone every night. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to fight harder for attention. It's to stop negotiating your own worth. Here's what I learned. Being needed is not the same as being valued. Being dependable is not the same as being seen. Being strong is not the same as being silent. I didn't leave because I hated him. I left because I could finally stand without him and realized I had been standing alone emotionally for years. Quiet dominance isn't about revenge. It isn't about making someone regret losing you. It's about knowing you can walk away calmly, without chaos, without cruelty, because you have already rebuilt yourself internally. Some marriages survive this awakening. Some don't. Mine didn't, but I did. And if there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Pay attention to the small cuts, not to become suspicious, not to become defensive, but to stay honest with yourself. If you feel invisible, ask gently. If nothing changes, prepare quietly. And if you ever have to choose between shrinking and standing alone, choose the version of you who can breathe fully. I'm curious, have you ever felt unseen in a relationship that looked perfectly fine from the outside? Tell me your experience in the comments.